what does this actually mean for Tibet? I mean, this is the Tibetans are a peaceful people and they haven't engaged in an uprising since 2009, is it? And what happens, Manoj, to the US's program? They've passed a law. The previous administration, Joe Biden, has passed a law aiming at pressuring Beijing into granting Tibet greater autonomy. And but it's also looks as if that really isn't going to go anywhere, because does this present US government have the same commitment, the same bandwidth to create some kind of sort of undercurrent against the Chinese Communist Party in Tibet?
Hi, Neena. Thank you so much for that question. So you ask if the present US government has a commitment for some sort of binding effort. My answer to that would be depending on which social media platform you're looking at and which day of the week it is, given how President Trump has been acting. But no, I mean, on a serious note, look,
No, but yes, we have to.
uh,
Didn't the Secretary of State Marco Rubio pass some kind of a resolution which is slightly more critical of China than before?
look, I think words are useful, words are good, but words are just words at the end of the day. So we'll wait and see. And also in terms of how the US government has been acting, under President Trump, given the number of fires that they have and given their domestic preoccupations, I'm not sure that Tibet is high on the priority list. So let me put it as that way. In terms of uh, how Washington seems to view Tibet today in terms of the broader dynamic with China, there is an element of affinity with Tibet, with the Dalai Lama. There's a long-standing relationship, and I think that stands right across the U.S. political community. Yet, what the U.S. would be willing to put at stake is something that I think something that in India we need to also consider seriously. I'm not necessarily certain that there will be a lot that will be put on stake. Already, you've applied sanctions. You've passed certain laws. In terms of whether this will be the hill that you will see the U.S. administration contest Beijing, not necessarily. It will be one point of friction, but not necessarily even high in that sources of friction, because there are several sources of friction between China and the U.S. From that perspective, my view is that there are also many unknowns in some ways, right? Because we're talking about a potential next Dalai Lama. It's interesting in the statement of the 14th Dalai Lama that was issued a day or so ago, he doesn't talk about his successor being born in the free world.
He
That
doesn't.
is, he doesn't mention that. That's mentioned in his book, but it's not mentioned in this statement. So I
I
think that's
see.
so it's quite a substantive omission in my view. Although he does recognize that the trust has the right to recognize his successor. Um, so I think so there are many unknowns in some ways in terms of how this operates. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind that the 14th Dalai Lama has a certain aura, a certain legacy, a certain romance about him. And he's been an excellent diplomat, if I was to say that, in terms of the Tibetan cause, right? He's been able
Yes.
to mobilize the world behind him. Are we certain that the 15th Dalai Lama carries the same gravitas with the Tibetan community and with the world at large? We don't know, right? This person ostensibly does not exist right now. So it's very
That's
difficult
true.
to think about what the future of the cause will be, how states would react. The one thing that I would say, that I can say with some level of as certain as perhaps I can be, is that you are unlikely to see any of the Western countries jump to recognize a Chinese appointed Dalai Lama. Because we are potentially heading towards two individuals occupying the title of the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
Um, and we're likely to see a contestation for legitimacy among those two individuals between these two entities, the PRC and the Tibetan administration. Um, and I don't think that anywhere in the West you will see legitimacy accorded very easily. And to me, that is also the question from an Indian point of view, the first question from of many from an Indian point of view. I mean, first of there are many questions. I mean, if the Dalai Lama is to pass away on Indian soil, how would you manage that? How would you manage pilgrimages? Also, then comes the key question of recognition and legitimizing the Chinese claim. So there are all of these sets of questions that lie before us.
That's true. That is true. So if I can come back to the fact that India has this contentious border issue with China, I mean, the Dalai Lama visiting Arunachal Pradesh, Manoj, if you remember, was slammed by the Chinese. They claimed it's part of China, which is completely wrong. Arunachal Chief Minister, of course, has welcomed the Dalai Lama's announcement. So, what is China's concern? Is it concerned there could be a repeat of the 1959 uprising against the occupation of Tibet, or is it worried about the CIA's operations then, which continued for several years, and or the more recent one?
Yeah, I don't think that the Chinese are particularly concerned about an uprising imminently. There is some anxiety around security threats. You had the Chinese leader who's in charge of their judicial and law enforcement ecosystem, Chen Wenqing, recently traveled to Qinghai, where he again stressed the threat of terrorism, extremism, splitism, and external powers acting to sort of incite some of that. So, that sort of stuff tells you that there is anxiety. When we've seen Xi Jinping visit Tibet, there's been a lot of, it's been in a hush hush manner to begin with. So that tells you that there are obviously security anxieties that exist within Beijing with regard to Tibet. But I don't think that there is any imminent concern around an uprising. I think that there is anxiety that you might see some sort of an emotional reaction to the passing of the Dalai Lama. You might see something to of that nature. Um,
But in
but my broader sense
2008,
is
but in
what Mr.
2008, Manoj, if I'd like just put a button for a second, is that the uprising was actually handled by Tibetans living in Nepal and living in India. It actually was, sort of they couldn't do a thing about it because it was, they took shelter in and sort of manufactured the whole, uprising from outside China, outside occupied Tibet.
Yeah, but a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then in terms of Chinese surveillance and security control in that region. And I don't think
Ah,
we should be discounting that. I think I will echo the point that Mr. Mathur made that, look, from Beijing's point of view, this is a policy of homogenization. It's a policy of sinicization of the religion to make sure that there is no external source of control. And I think that is something that is critical to Chinese from their perspective of their national security and sovereignty. That's been this Communist Party's view from very early on. So it's not simply about a religious issue. They see it fundamentally as a political issue. They see it as a issue from a national security, territorial integrity, and sovereignty perspective. And therefore, and from a cultural point of view, they see it as a need to homogenize this community within the broader sort of sinicized worldview. So you're likely to see, therefore, that policy continue in Tibet, whatever happens going down the road. But yeah, I think I will agree that there is concern around security challenges with regard to the passing of the Dalai Lama, with regard to the emergence of a new Dalai Lama, and what that could mean internally. Yet I think that the ability to be able to control that has generally significantly improved since 2008. The surveillance capacity is significantly improved. Of course, at the end of the day, it depends on the nature of an uprising. It depends on nature of how many people come to the streets, what it's like. We all assumed that Beijing would easily be able to control any sort of public outcry given its capabilities. But we saw that in 2022 when zero COVID got challenged, and there were protests across streets in China. The
yes.
party was not able to contain the spread of those protests. It had to eventually surrender and abandon the policy. And its estimation was in that sense correct. That this is a frustration with a particular policy. If we shift along with subsequently repress, we'll be able to manage it, and they were able to manage. So it depends on the scale of what the outpouring is, and in Tibet, we'll see what the scale is. But there is
But
anxiety.
you agree? I mean, these are top Chinese companies which are being affected. Oppo, Vivo, they have production facilities in India. Apple is a target. China is actively stopping companies moving their manufacturing to India.
Yeah.
So should India have a counter game in place? I mean, we all say you should dance with the dragon and build. I mean, do you think we should?
So I'll answer that question. I just wanted to go back to your question about 2003.
Yes,
Again, I'm not privy to any of the conversations that took place, but just from the outcomes, if you see, there was a formal recognition from India of Tibet being part of the PRC. At the same
yes,
time, in 2003 June, same meetings where we set up the special representatives for the boundary dispute, right? So there perhaps was some sort of a give and take in that context to be able to try and move towards resolving the boundary issue. Of course, it's not been resolved since then. On this issue of Chinese economic coercion, look, to me, Beijing is today looking at the world and it believes that it's in a position that it has never been historically in terms of the position of power. It is key to global supply chains. It realizes that economic coercion today, and it's not new. China has used economic coercion, in the past with, say, with Norway on salmon,
absolutely.
Philippines on bananas. So it's not new, this economic coercion. But what Beijing is realizing today is that it's developing a toolkit of systematic economic coercion backed by laws, backed by regulation, and obviously the objective is political. What it's doing with India on different issues is for different reasons, right? So the rare earth magnets is a part of I mean, that emerged because of its policy with regard to the United States in response to Trump's tariffs and so on and so forth. The downstream effects of this, of course, were felt by Indian companies and European companies. And since then, it's seen this as a tool that you can leverage governments to come to the negotiating table and talk. It can also use that to sort of punish companies if it wants to. To me, the answer to that rare earth issue, the magnets issue, is somewhere between governments talking, but also in the long term for industry to de-risk. If industry believes that it wants to buy cheaper products and make more profits without caring about resilience of its supply chains, that's the industry's problem. Then don't come back to the government and say that, look, you need to solve this for us. So you understand the geopolitical environment, kindly try to start to de-risk, kindly build resilience, kindly build longer stockpiles. There's a whole range of things that you can do. In terms of China trying to impact adversely India's industrialization process and India's manufacturing sector. I think this is again the development that we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years, where we went from a period where the Chinese wanted to invest in India. India has restricted that investment. In the meantime, Chinese companies in India have felt treated adversely. And you've seen
Hmm.
the debate within China turn around and say, hey, look, are we in some way subsidizing our own rivals' industrial sector? And that debate
Oh, that's an
in China
interesting point.
has taken place over the last 5 years. And increasingly, the kind of actions that were taking place tells you that the security hardliners in China, the sort of more protectionist groups, have won out in some senses in that debate. One part of that is a debate within the Chinese economic sort of business ecosystem, because Chinese businesses would like to chase economies of scale, would like to chase cheaper labor, and so on and so forth, particularly as the external environment becomes difficult for China through tariffs and other means in the West. But the Chinese government's view is, hey, look, do we want to transfer all this low end manufacturing capacity, which may no longer be competitive for many reasons, but also partly because east of China is much more wealthy, labor costs are much
Yes.
high. So,
Yeah.
so should we transfer it to, should we allow it to be transferred to other countries, or should we seek ways in which we can subsidize its transfer to inland of China? Right, with the sort of interiors of China which are not well developed. And you can see that debate also playing out within China. So in that sense, it's much more than just economic coercion. But with regard to India, there are elements of economic coercion that we are seeing, and I think we should be prepared for much more of this, because what Beijing is doing is learning from the United States that you need a substantive, clear toolkit to be able to do this, of sanctions for political issues. We are seeing also a former Philippine senator has been sanctioned recently. So it's not
Hmm.
just simply a tit for tat game. They're now trying to use this uh, sort of preemptively against countries, against individuals, against companies. And so we should be prepared for much more of this, which all means that governments should indicate to enterprise and industry in India that you need to de-risk on a priority. You need to build resilience. That does not mean you can't trade with China. That does not mean you don't need to have a supply chain linked with China. But that does not mean that but that means that your dependence cannot be so overwhelming that you cripple yourself because the Chinese decided one day to shut the tap. Brief remark is that whatever the history may be, and we will have to contend with complexities in the future. And I don't think we can escape that however we landed up with this issue. It's an issue that's on our table and we will have to contend with it. I agree. It's not a core concern for India. But it will lead to friction between India and China if we are unable to manage it effectively. What that effective management is far more complicated for 10 seconds.
Very interesting point.